Chapter 4 Jesus, Lord and King, Part 1. With this chapter, we begin the task of presenting the evidence for Jesus' kingship and the present reality of his kingdom. This task is essential, for if Jesus is a ruling king over a kingdom that exists now on earth, and if King Jesus enables and commands a radically new way of life within it, then there is a real and necessary alternative to the kingdoms of this world and their violent ways. Therefore, this chapter and several that follow present the most important evidence given to support the claim that Christians must love all enemies, resist not the evil man, refuse to employ violence and coercion, and remain separate from the state or any other entity that practices violence and refuses to love all enemies. If Jesus is not a real king now ruling over a real kingdom, the claims made in this book cannot stand. However, the Scriptures, the Apostles, the Ante-Nicaeans, and the history of God's true people do in fact support the claims made here. In fact, these claims are not new but ancient. Most will find the claim that Jesus is king and rules over his kingdom unobjectionable and not in need of any proof. However, the picture of Jesus' kingship and kingdom presented here is not what passes for conventional wisdom in 21st century Christianity, where Jesus is just a king of our hearts and his kingdom is similarly located, and therefore Christians must find their politics and public ethics from the state in which they are born. Others believe that Jesus' visible kingdom now includes the nations, and Christians can and must fully participate in the state, thereby advancing Jesus' rule over the kingdoms of this world. Their project is to make the state Christian. Neither of these positions nor variations of them represent the position taken here. To reiterate, I argue that Jesus is a real king over his church, not simply a king in our hearts. He is an absolute sovereign monarch who commands our obedience and demands a singular, undivided loyalty. His claim upon us is complete and permits no other loyalties, no matter how limited. We, his church, are the instantiation of his present kingdom, where he has organized us spiritually, socially, economically, and hence politically. Thus, it is a real kingdom separate and distinct from any other kingdom such as the United States, France, or Germany. We do not hold a dual citizenship even if we possess a passport. Our citizenship in the earthly kingdoms in which we live is not the normal kind. We are citizens only in virtue of our birth or some other event. This is so because of Jesus' unlimited claim on us, the reality of his kingdom, and the reality that all other kingdoms are part of the rebellious principalities and powers at war with our sovereign, and their means and ends are the antithesis of our king's means and ends. This, of course, is not what most mean when they say Jesus is a king of a kingdom. To prove these claims, we must embark on a rather long journey, properly begun in the Old Testament. Section 4.1. The King in the Old Testament. The scarlet messianic thread that is ultimately woven into a magnificent tapestry begins with a terse and cryptic promise from God to Adam and Eve, coming shortly after they sinned. The Lord God said to the serpent, "Because you have done this, cursed are you more than all cattle, and more than every beast of the field. On your belly will you go, and dust you will eat all the days of your life. And I will put enmity between you and the woman, and between your seed and her seed. He shall bruise you on the head, and you shall bruise him on the heel." Adam's rebellion has just condemned mankind to death in all its manifestations, and the cosmos to bondage. But God leaves them with the promise that he will, by one born of the woman, defeat the serpent who deceived Eve. Even though their rebellion has shattered the very cosmos, they are not left without hope. However, they are only given the slimmest understanding of what the defeat of their enemy will mean. Unknown to them is that the rest of human history is a progressive revelation of God's plan, culminating in the Promised One to redeem mankind, restore obedience and the creation, and thereby glorify Himself. We see a bit more of the tapestry when we come to God's friend, Abraham. To Abraham is given a very special covenant, an unconditional covenant, that he and his descendants will inherit the land of Canaan, that his progeny will flourish, becoming a great nation, and that in Abraham all nations will be blessed. It is very likely that Abraham, as he reflected on God's promise to Adam and Eve, and the covenant God had just made with him, thought that a male from his lineage would crush the serpent's head and, in some sense, undo the catastrophic effects of the fall. The Abrahamic covenant becomes a little bit clearer during an encounter between God and Jacob, when God renames him Israel. God reaffirms the Abrahamic covenant with Jacob and elaborates a bit. Kings will come forth from him. This was implicit in God's communication to Abraham, but it has now become explicit. Jacob, when he is pronouncing blessings upon his sons shortly before his death, said that Judah would rule over his brothers. This is a royal reference, for Jacob employs the royal symbols of scepter and staff in his prophecy. Once again, we can imagine Jacob, now Israel, contemplating the meaning of the covenant. The one to crush the serpent's head and thereby bring a blessing to the world was going to be a king from the line of his son Judah. Several things are important to notice in the Adamic and Abrahamic covenants. First, the prophets make clear that the scope of God's plan to bring a blessing is wrapped up in the coming of a king who will come from the line of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Every hope of mankind is wrapped up in this one man. Second, the blessing this king brings is for all nations. God's plan is in this sense universal, not limited to one group. Thus, it is not surprising that when this king comes, both Jews and Gentiles participate in his redemptive plan. God's plan, the scarlet messianic thread, takes on more texture and complexity when we come to the Mosaic covenant. This conditional covenant is separate and distinct from the Adamic and Abrahamic covenants, and in no way supersedes them. This covenant, made with Abraham's descendants, is a promise to bless and maintain them in the land given to Abraham as long as they are obedient to the law God had given to Moses. God makes it clear to Moses that the Jewish people will not be faithful and suffer judgment. Therefore, the question arises, how will God be faithful to his promise that through them he will bring a blessing to the world by undoing, in some sense, the fall, if they will not obey him and thus come under his judgment? This is no small matter, but God does not explicitly answer it. However, he does point in the direction the answer will be found when, through Moses, he promises a prophet like Moses, who will arise from among them and speak to them all that God commands him. The answer is therefore found by looking back to the Adamic and Abrahamic covenants. Their hope is bound up in the one man, not the nation or corporate body of Israel, who will crush the serpent's head and bring blessing upon the world. God will raise up a king who is also a prophet like Moses to teach them his ways. Section 4.1.1 The Davidic Covenant. Much more of the tapestry is woven with the Davidic covenant, and we find that this covenant forms the foundation for virtually all subsequent references to the coming king. This covenant permeates the rest of the Old Testament and the New Testament. Therefore, it is vital that we understand it thoroughly. We find it recorded in several passages. Consider the quote from 1 Chronicles. Moreover, I tell you that the Lord will build a house for you. When your days are fulfilled, that you must go to be with your fathers, that I will set up one of your descendants after you, who will be of your sons, and I will establish his kingdom. He shall build for me a house, and I will establish his throne forever. I will be his father, and he shall be my son, and I will not take my loving kindness away from him, as I took it from him who was before you. But I will settle him in my house and in my kingdom forever, and his throne shall be established forever. The Davidic covenant is the unconditional promise of a final eschatological king from David's lineage, whose reign will never end, and who will build God a house, that is, a temple. Beyond the explicit promise, there is implied, by the building of a temple, the promise of God's continued presence. For where the temple is, God is. It is further implied that God will perpetually care for and rule over his people through this king, who apparently will not die, for his reign has no end. This also implies the final defeat of all enemies. It is a perfect extension of the Abrahamic covenant. This will become even clearer when the prophets predict that the king's reign is not only perpetual, but universal. At the time David receives the covenant, its full scope and importance may not have been understood. However, given the worldwide blessing of the Abrahamic covenant and the royal clarification given to Jacob, it is likely that David and others familiar with these covenants must have understood that the promise to David encompassed the one referred to in the Adamic and Abrahamic covenants. Thus, the king is a king of the eschaton. David, his contemporaries, and others who closely followed these events must have thought something like this. For although David's immediate heir, Solomon, built the first temple, he could not have been considered the fulfillment of this covenant, not only because he rebelled against God and his temple was destroyed, but also because of the nature of the king that fulfills the covenant. The king is rather special, for he must live forever, because his throne is to be established forever. If this meant only that the kingdom would not depart from the king's lineage, then this could equally be claimed of David, but it is not. It could only be referring to the one who could sit upon the throne forever, that is, live eternally. Therefore, this could not have been fulfilled by Solomon, nor by any other Jewish king prior to King Jesus. Ultimately, Solomon's reign and behavior are a harbinger of what was to come. And even though the nation had some good kings, as a rule the kings and their subjects slid into perpetual rebellion and forsook God, just as God had told Moses would happen. The descent happens quickly with Solomon's son, who loses the 10 northern tribes, which abandon the law of Moses and are taken into captivity. The southern 2 tribes, Judah and Benjamin, survive somewhat longer, but eventually are taken away into exile for their rebellion. Some 70 years later, a remnant returns to the Promised Land, but neither the monarchy nor God's divine presence return to the people. The absence of the monarchy and God's presence are characteristic of God's judgment. Israel is in a real sense not forgiven and remained in exile, even if some made it back to the land. Even up until Jesus' time, the Jewish people still believed themselves to be in exile, and many believed that the Herodian temple was an abomination and ought to be torn down, and the real temple built. As Israel descends into rebellion with Solomon and the kings that follow, and it becomes clear that the monarchy and the kingdom will be taken away from Israel, and that God's presence will be removed, the Davidic covenant takes on greater importance, especially as God, through his prophets, sheds more light on the Messiah's task. The Abrahamic and Davidic covenants that promise a final king that will restore all things become the focus of all their hopes, for it is clear that God's people have failed, as predicted in Deuteronomy 31. Section 4.2. Old Testament expectations clarify and develop. With the Davidic covenant, we have our foundation, but there is much more to examine. However, before we examine more messianic expectations in the Old Testament, we must look at a bit more history. We pick up the story with Solomon. Solomon's rise and fall is one of the saddest stories in the entire Bible. The wisest man to walk the earth apart from Christ, and the son of Israel's greatest king, abandons Yahweh and becomes an idolater. It is a pattern frequently repeated in the Old Testament. The sons of a good king become evil. Fortunately, the reverse happens, and the son of an evil king comes back to obedience. The trend, however, is ever lower, as it must be, for Yahweh had seen the future and had communicated it to Moses and the people when they were about to enter the land after wandering in the wilderness. Solomon's fall, characterized by narcissism, the accumulation of wealth, a massive military buildup, and the establishment of a huge harem, the enslavement of many of his people to build his cities and other great works, sets up a crisis that irrevocably splits the kingdom. So oppressive is Solomon's reign that when his son Rehoboam ascends to the throne, the people coming to make him king first request that he lighten the burden and the heavy yoke his father had placed on them. If he does so, they will serve him. Rehoboam's response is as tragic as it is harsh. He will be far worse than his father. The people are incensed, and the 10 northern tribes decide they have had enough of the house of David and depart and select a new king, Jeroboam. Only Judah and Benjamin remain loyal to Rehoboam. The northern kingdom quickly fell into idolatry, having refused to worship at Jerusalem, and was finally defeated by the Assyrian Empire and carried away into exile 210 years later. The southern kingdom lasted somewhat longer, 136 years longer, but it also forsook God and embraced idolatry and was subsequently defeated by the Babylonian Empire and carried away into exile. God's words to Moses had come true. Israel, except for a small remnant, would forsake her God and judgment would follow. Some from Judah and Benjamin, after a 70-year exile in Babylon, came back to the land to rebuild Jerusalem and the temple. But neither the kingdom, that is home rule, nor God's divine presence, signified by the divine fire and smoke, returned, and the people even into Jesus' day believed themselves to be in exile, oppressed by their enemies and unforgiven by their God. 840 years after leaving the oppression of Egypt, Israel is once again exiled and enslaved. As the southern and northern kingdoms begin their slide into idolatry and ultimate abandonment of God, God begins to send his prophets, men who speak for God, warning the people of the consequences of the rebellion and the blessing God is willing to give if they return and obey. Of course, both kingdoms continue on their downward path, and both are destroyed. An urgent question now arises. Given that it is through Israel that God has promised to work, how is he now going to redeem the world and undo the evil of the fall? Israel has rebelled, and the kingdom is destroyed, and God has withdrawn his divine presence from his temple. What will happen to Israel? What will happen to the rest of the world? How is God going to fulfill his covenant? The answer is that God himself will act through his anointed one of the line of David. Thus, even though unfaithful Israel has failed, God himself will fulfill his covenants with Adam, Abraham, and David. What is not revealed is that the anointed one of David's covenant and Isaiah's suffering servant are one and the same. Nor is it clear that he is divine, the second person of the Trinity. It is at this time that the Davidic covenant takes on special significance. Israel's hope, the Gentiles' hope, the entire world's hope is bound up in God working in and through one man, a king who God himself will appoint and who will speak his words and do his will. The hope is very specific. God will work through a real king who rules eternally over the entire earth, a king who defeats real enemies and frees his people from the bondage of exile. Notice that it is simply impossible to separate his rule, his government, his governance, his politics, if you will, from his spiritual activity. For the world to be made whole, God must send a real king who will comprehensively restore his people and his creation. Nothing else will do. And for Israel in exile, nothing is more important than for this king to come. The danger here is for us to read the paragraph above, just like many of us have read the scriptures, and impose upon it the prevailing understanding of Jesus' kingship, a kingship so diminished that it has no real meaning at all. It has diminished in part from a misguided and rebellious desire to make God and Jesus after our own image, and in the West, from the general belief that monarchies are somehow bad forms of government. Republics or democracies are preferred. And so the mistaken belief persists that Jesus is only a king over my heart. His real reign is coming sometime in the future. The truth is that Jesus is a real king at this very moment in every meaningful sense that a king is a king, and more, we will find that we must understand him first after his divinity as a king, his saving, his redeeming, his freeing, and everything else he does are possible only because he is the long-awaited king who rules over all. The good news is that the king is here. The Old Testament clearly understood the Messiah as a real king, and the New Testament persists in this understanding. So must we, if we are faithful to God's Word. After having developed this bit of history to help us better understand the Old Testament context, let us now examine what the various writers had to say about this king and his kingdom. Section 4.2.1 Divine Origin. The long-promised king and his kingdom are of divine origin and are firmly embedded in the Davidic covenant. It is God acting to save his people and his creation by beginning to undo what men had done at the fall. All of history, especially Israel's history, had proven that mankind, even when given God's blessing embodied in the Mosaic law, is unable to live as God commands. For man to live in obedience, God himself must act. This king is God's king and is divinely anointed and appointed. Furthermore, he is divinely established and empowered. His reign will not end, for God himself will establish it. And this king will accomplish all God desires, for God himself will empower him. And finally, this king is divinely exalted and glorified. These themes occur over and over in the Old Testament and are repeated in the New. Once again, we must be careful how we understand what the Scriptures say about what is divinely established and empowered. We must resist the temptation to impose our modern anthropocentric Christianity with its focus almost entirely on the individual and personal salvation. What the psalmists and the prophets make clear is that a king will come and establish a kingdom over which he will exercise real authority, and from his position as God's divinely anointed king and establishment of his kingdom, he will utterly change not only individuals, but the world they inhabit. Section 4.2.2 Names and Titles. The names and titles given to the Anointed One, in Greek Christ and in Hebrew the Messiah, reveal different dimensions of his activity and nature, and most are frequently employed by the writers of the New Testament. The most important names are those that directly name the heir to the Davidic covenant and carry the clear meaning of kingship. Among these are King, Messiah, Prince, Leader, Commander. This Anointed One is first and foremost the king who comes to rule. Closely related to these is the branch of Jesse, or simply the branch. When this reference appears, it is a deliberate reference to the one who fulfills the Davidic covenant. Another name, the Son of Man, carries tremendous royal weight in light of Daniel 7, for it is one like a Son of Man to whom God gives everlasting dominion over the world and whom all will serve. As in much of Daniel, the context in which this appears is dramatic and eschatological, and comes about in a vision given to Daniel about a coming earthly and angelic conflict, encompassing a titanic conflict between kingdoms and the total victory of God over all his enemies. Daniel's vision begins with the telling of great bloody battles between four fantastic beasts that in the interpretation are identified as four coming kings. As these kings rage in battle, the focus turns to the throne room of heaven, and a magnificent vision of God upon his throne appears as he sits as judge in his court. I kept looking until thrones were set up, and the Ancient of Days took his seat. His vesture was like white snow, and the hair of his head like pure wool. His throne was ablaze with flames. Its wheels were a burning fire. A river of fire was flowing and coming out from before him. Thousands upon thousands were attending him, and myriads upon myriads were standing before him. The court sat, and the books were opened. These evil kings have done their worst, and now God comes to judge. No one can stay his hand, and in his judgment one of the beasts is slain, and his body burned, and the dominion of the others is taken away, but they are allowed to rule a while longer. And when we turn back to the throne room, God reveals the one who will now rule. I kept looking in the night visions, and behold, with the clouds of heaven, one like a son of man was coming, and he came up to the Ancient of Days, and was presented before him. And to him was given dominion, glory, and a kingdom, that all the peoples, nations, and men of every language might serve him. His dominion is an everlasting dominion, which will not pass away, and his kingdom is one which will not be destroyed. This is a picture, a very powerful and beautiful picture of God establishing the rule of David's heir. It is no wonder, then, that the Son of Man became identified so closely with the Messiah. Likewise, the Son of God carries a similar weight, for in Psalm 2, it is to the begotten Son to whom the Father will give the nations as your inheritance. The psalm opens up on a scene of rebellion. The nations are raging against God and his anointed. Despite their rage, they have no power over God and his Messiah, and God, looking down from heaven, laughs and scoffs, for he will speak to them in his anger and terrify them in his fury, saying, "But as for me, I have installed my king upon Zion, my holy mountain." And then the Messiah replies, "I will surely tell of the decree of the Lord. He said to me, 'You are my son, today I have begotten you. Ask of me, and I will surely give the nations as your inheritance, and the very ends of the earth as your possession.'" Consequently, we find that the Son of God is the promised Davidic king. Thus, the high priest at Jesus' trial fully understands the messianic claim Jesus is making when he confesses that he is the Son of God. Interestingly, unlike the Son of Man, a name Jesus is fond of, the Son of God persists into the apostolic writings. Stone and chief cornerstone are two more important names that identify the one who comes to rule as heir of the Davidic covenant. In chapter 2 of his prophecy, Daniel, by divine revelation, recounts Nebuchadnezzar's dream and then interprets it. The dream is frightening and consists of two main components: a statue large and splendorous, with a head of fine gold, breast and arms of silver, the belly and thighs of bronze, its legs of iron, and its feet a mixture of iron and clay, and finally a most extraordinary stone. This stone is cut out without hands and crushes and grinds to dust the great statue. We are told that the statue represents 4 earthly kingdoms, and that the stone, after crushing these kingdoms, grows to become a great mountain that fills the whole earth. The stone represents God's coming king and kingdom, an everlasting kingdom that will crush and put an end to all other kingdoms. The context of Daniel 2 is imperial. dealing with the establishment of a kingdom and the complete destruction of all others. In the modern sense, it has no spiritual overtones. This is a story about kings and kingdoms, conquest and defeat, imperial rise and decline, and it is also eschatological. Furthermore, given the Davidic covenant, this can only refer to the establishment of the final Davidic king. It is no wonder that when Jesus refers to himself as the stone or the chief cornerstone, he incites an intense response from the Jewish leaders. Jesus is claiming to be the rightful heir of the Davidic covenant and is about to assert his rule and establish his kingdom. Finally, the name shepherd also carries royal connotations, for it is the king as shepherd who protects and leads his people. For obvious reasons, shepherd is tied closely to David himself. We could also consider the other ways the writers of the Old Testament referred to the Messiah, such as servant, redeemer, and Prince of Peace. We could consider as well the cryptic and puzzling references to the Messiah's divinity that were difficult for non-Trinitarian monotheistic Jews to comprehend. For now, suffice it to say that only the divine Messiah, as the suffering servant, could save and redeem his people. Most people identifying themselves as Christians today view Jesus from a very private and personal perspective, a view utterly beneath Jesus' real identity. In its less malignant forms, they see Jesus primarily as a personal savior. In its more malignant forms, Jesus, their fire insurance agent, comes to hand out things such as peace, personal fulfillment, self-actualization, purpose, etc. These things are certainly a consequence of the Messiah's coming, but they do not even begin to describe him or the scope of his work. What is completely absent today is Jesus, the long-awaited King who has established his kingdom among his people, who summons men and women to obedience, the King who has defeated our greatest enemies, enabled a new way of life by the power of the Spirit that was previously unknown, and created the world anew for his people. It is this latter Messiah that the prophets of the Old Testament proclaimed and to which the writers of the New Testament bore witness. If idolatry is worshiping something other than God, and it is, then those who worship the modern Jesus are idolaters, for he bears no resemblance to the real Jesus. Section 4.2.3 Activity. The Messiah's principal activity in fulfilling the Abrahamic and Davidic covenants is to ascend to his throne and establish his kingdom with those he will lead from exile, the exile to which God had subjected them because of their rebellion. Only by asserting his rule, defeating his enemies, freeing his people, and establishing his kingdom does God, through his Messiah, fulfill his covenant promises and set to right what was destroyed at the fall. Of course, all this is accomplished as the Messiah makes himself a propitiation for sin on the cross. It is essential that we understand all aspects of the Messiah's activity within the framework of ascending to his throne and establishing his kingdom, for only the Messiah can perform this work of deliverance. As we pointed out in a previous chapter, the good news is that the crucified and risen Messiah is Lord. We must also resist the ever-present temptation to assume that his kingship and kingdom are only spiritual, for the Old and New Testaments do not permit such a reading. The Messiah is a real king with a real kingdom. The ascent to his throne. The Messiah ascends to his eternal throne to establish his righteous and just rule, not only because he is the rightful Davidic heir, but because he gave himself as a guilt offering, dying on the cross to deliver many. This was probably not clear prior to the New Testament, for they did not understand that the Messiah and Isaiah's suffering servant were the same person. Passages such as John 1:29 and 36, Acts 8:32 and 33, and Isaiah 53:7 make the connection. From this we see that the Messiah's ascent to his throne and the establishment of his kingdom are bound up in his activity as a suffering servant. This is why the cross and his suffering on it become central in the Messiah's work in the New Testament. Establishment of the kingdom. The establishment of a kingdom is neither simple nor easy, for enemies must be defeated. The Messiah's enemies are titanic. Examine the imagery and description of his enemies in Daniel 7 and elsewhere, and you will find that they are powerful and evil beyond description. But enabled by the Father, and as his anointed one, the Messiah utterly defeats them all. He grinds them to dust. It must not be lost on us that all this is accomplished non-violently, as Jesus endures the cross. That this would be the way God would act is predicted in Isaiah. Behold, my servant whom I uphold, my chosen one in whom my soul delights. I have put my spirit upon him. He will bring forth justice to the nations. He will not cry out or raise his voice, nor make his voice heard in the street. A bruised reed he will not break, and a dimly burning wick he will not extinguish. He will faithfully bring forth justice. He will not be disheartened or crushed until he has established justice in the earth, and the coastlands will wait expectantly for his law. But the Lord was pleased to crush him, putting him to grief. If he would render himself as a guilt offering, he will see his offspring. He will prolong his days, and the good pleasure of the Lord will prosper in his hand. He was oppressed, and he was afflicted, yet he did not open his mouth. Like a lamb that is led to slaughter, and like a sheep that is silent before its shearers, so he did not open his mouth. As a result of the anguish of his soul, he will see it and be satisfied. By his knowledge, the righteous one, my servant, will justify the many, as he will bear their iniquities. Therefore I will allot him a portion with the great, and he will divide the booty with the strong, because he poured out himself to death, and was numbered with the transgressors. Yet he himself bore the sin of many, and interceded for the transgressors. Non-resistance characterizes the Father's and the Son's great redemptive plan for mankind. However, another problem remains after his enemies are defeated and sins are forgiven. His people remain in exile, and without subjects there is no kingdom. Thus the Messiah both defeats his enemies and leads his people out of exile, ending their slavery to both his and their enemies. Exile and Exodus. As the prophets begin their warnings, Israel finds herself hurtling towards exile. Exile, as the Scriptures understand it, is the worst condition in which a human may be found. Exile is not only separation from God's rule and protection, it is also to endure God's punishment. For the faithless Jew, this punishment included separation from the promised land and from their enemies, slavery and oppression. The exile lived something less than a true human life. As Israel's exile envelops the nation, and it is clear that Israel has failed to such an extent that the kingdom will be taken from her, it becomes clear that God himself must act to save his people. It is not enough that Israel has been blessed beyond words, having been given God's law and prophets, for Israel is utterly shipwrecked. What God had told Moses before they entered the land had come true. Israel had abandoned her God and was about to suffer the fearful judgment God had promised. But the exile to which Israel was destined was as old as mankind itself, for all from Adam onward were in exile. They had known no other condition except God's judgment and slavery and oppression by their enemies, including sin and death. The Jew, even after being so blessed by his God, had ended up at the same place as the Gentile, and they had both ended up in this condition for the same reason: rebellion against God's rule and law. As Israel entered exile, several things were clear. First, mankind could not undo the effects of the fall, and remained in rebellion, even when blessed by God, as Israel was blessed And second, mankind's only hope was God, and he had to act to save and redeem mankind from slavery, and fundamentally change mankind, and restore obedience, and address the other effects of the fall. Thankfully, to this end, God had all along promised, unconditionally promised, his anointed one, the Messiah, the final heir to David's throne, who would perform these essential tasks. The defeat of enemies. The king's first task, then, to end the exile, is to defeat his people's enemies, those who hold them captive and prisoners in slavery. Paul uses wonderful imagery when describing their defeat. He disarmed the rulers and authorities and made a public display of them, having triumphed over them through him. First, among those are sin and death. Having enslaved ourselves to sin by a rebellion, we allowed Satan to lay claim to us and hold us in bondage. Death also holds us in bondage, since all men die, for sin reigns in death, and man, apart from Christ, lives in fear of death. Thus Christ redeems us from slavery to sin by his sacrifice on the cross. For in his death we die to sin and are freed from sin, and he frees us from death in our participation in his resurrection. And then lastly, the final bodily resurrection at the last day. Also, found among our enemies, now humiliated and disarmed, are real nations and principalities and powers that Paul speaks so much about and which we will carefully consider in a later chapter. The gift of the Spirit. The king must also end the persistent cause of exile, rebellion itself, the manifestation of the law of sin, by fundamentally changing his people, changing them in such a way that they are bent towards obedience rather than disobedience, hence breaking the cycle of exile and exodus. God accomplishes this by enacting through his king a new covenant with his people. God effects this change in those who place themselves under his rule by putting his Spirit within them. Thus he will cause them to walk in his statutes, and they will be careful to observe his ordinances. That is, God restores the ability to obey him. The means and form by which God would accomplish this could not have been fully understood at the time, for it was completely beyond what anyone would have imagined possible. The full scope of its meaning was only possible at Pentecost, when the divine presence that had dwelt in the Holy of Holies entered those in the upper room. Ezekiel 36:26 was now clear. God would now dwell in men and women as he dwelt in the Holy of Holies, empowering them to obey his commands. God was going to effect the greatest change mankind had ever known by dwelling in men and women. By God's very own presence, he would bring his power to bear, and men and women would now be careful to observe his ordinances. Obedience rather than rebellion would be normative. Being thus transformed and their enemies disarmed and led away in humiliation, God's people would live in a world created anew. God, by his own strong right arm, would save his people and the cosmos, and thereby glorify himself. God's servant king. Finally, the king must deal with the exile's guilt. Jew and Gentile alike have been sent into exile because they have sinned, rebelling against God's rule and law, and stand guilty before him. The exile has earned this punishment, and he must pay for his crimes. Man's deliverance from slavery and exile, a task fit only for a king, is performed by God's servant king, who is pierced for the exile's transgressions, becoming a guilt offering to justify many. Thus the exile finds forgiveness. For this self-sacrifice, God glorifies his servant, allotting him a portion among the great. And it is for the servant's law that the nations expectantly wait. And it is the servant who will establish justice in the earth. Thus the servant is not only the sacrifice for sin, but has power and authority over the nations and the power to judge and establish law. Those royal tasks the king is destined to perform, and mercifully his people, those who participate in his great exodus, will be both Jew and Gentile. God's promise to bless all peoples will come at last. Once again, let us emphasize that only God's divinely anointed king could accomplish this. He frees, saves, and forgives those in exile because he is the king. We must always, first and foremost, understand Jesus as Lord and King. Section 4.2.4 Consequences of His Coming. The ultimate consequence of the King's presence is nothing less than a complete transformation. The end of the exile, the defeat of enemies, the power and presence of God's Spirit, the exile's redemption, forgiveness and justification, and at the center of it all, the establishment of the Messiah's throne and kingdom which have no end. After the King came, the world was not the same. In addition to what has been mentioned already, there are several more dimensions of this transformation that must be examined. These are the turning of weapons into farm tools, the rebuilding of the temple, the return of God's divine presence to his people, the entrance of the Gentiles into God's kingdom, and the message to and deliverance of the blind, needy, and meek. Weapons, farm tools, and peace. The king, by defeating enemies and transforming his people, will bring peace among them. With their enemies disarmed, they have no need to war. And in their transformation, they both obey God's law, refusing the way of violence, and live in peace among themselves. With no need for instruments of war, they transform them into instruments of peace. And is it any wonder that this will happen? Of course not, for God himself will reign among his people and bring peace to them. The church is the first fruits among the nations that hammer their swords into plowshares and their spears into pruning hooks. This view is not exceptional and was held by the early church. The temple and God's presence. With the destruction of the temple in 586 BC, God withdrew his presence. The people were driven into exile, and the kingdom of Israel ended. God's departure was a disaster of immense proportions. In this desperate condition, God mercifully promised that he would, by his anointed, restore the remnant, rebuild his temple, dwell among them once again, and establish a new covenant, putting his Spirit within them. What they did not know was that the new temple would be grander than any could have imagined, for they would be God's temple, and his divine presence would dwell in them. The Gentile and the people of God. Another important consequence is that the Gentile was to become part of the people of God. No longer will the Jew be the only one to enter the temple and participate in God's blessings, but the Gentile, the dog, the outsider will come and worship like Jacob's descendants. God's promise to Abraham that in him all nations will be blessed will be fulfilled. The blind, meek, needy, and guilty. Finally, we find that the marginalized and needy in society find their place and are properly cared for and healed. In this kingdom, the blind see, and the deaf hear, the meek increase, and the needy and poor are saved. And lastly, the guilty are now justified when they repent. Section 4.2.5. The Kingdom, Character and Nature. Its character. The kingdom is glorious and beautiful. It is full of joy, feasting, abundance, blessing, salvation, mercy, truth, and forgiveness. Everything is abundantly supplied. Righteousness and justice mark this kingdom, and God and His Spirit are present within it. The kingdom is properly described as a lavish gift. In the eschaton, the kingdom will be established worldwide, but these kingdom blessings exist now when God's people fully obey their king. Its nature. The kingdom that David's heir reigns over is in no way limited in time, space, or authority. Rather, this kingdom is universal, worldwide, indestructible, everlasting, and extends over all mankind, Jew and Gentile alike. This is the kingdom that will put an end to all other kingdoms. For those who have confessed Jesus as Lord and King, it already has put an end to all other kingdoms. Section 4.2.6. Old Testament. Concluding remarks. God's future king and kingdom, described in the Old Testament, are magnificent and completely transform the world. Unfortunately, many insist that this kingdom, that is Jesus' kingdom, is in no way actually present in the sense that Jesus now rules over His people, has His own kingdom law, and that those who profess to follow Him are really citizens of His kingdom and may not participate in the kingdoms of this world. What passes for the kingdom today, mostly a weak kingdom of the heart, bears little resemblance to the prophetic kingdom, even though the kingdom promises have largely been fulfilled. If one reflects for even a short time on what was promised and what has been accomplished since Jesus ascended to the right hand of the Father, we must say that the really essential messianic acts have been fulfilled. Thus, in a very real sense, the long-awaited King has come and established His kingdom and new covenant. In the Old Testament, everything is bound up in the coming King. The King is Savior, Redeemer, ender of exile, defeater of enemies, and establishes a new covenant. He saves because He is King, and He ends their exile because He is King. The King is at the center of all God's future activities. For God's redemptive plan, nothing is more important than the King. Many prefer to identify Jesus as someone other than the King, and for all practical purposes ignore the reality of His kingdom. The Scriptures will have none of it. God's King is at the center of all God's activity, and it is this King in whom God sums up all things, both in heaven and earth. Below, we will find that the New Testament continues the theme. Section 4.3. The King in the New Testament. Just as King Jesus was at the center of the Old Testament, so He is in the New. If Jesus is anything in the New Testament, He is a king, and not just a king in or over our hearts, or a spiritual king, but a king that has come to rule over His people, the nations, and the entire cosmos. His rule over His people is visible, for they corporately constitute the present visual instantiation of His kingdom and live under His law. He rules invisibly over the nations, unwilling to crush them in judgment, for He is patient, wanting all to come to the knowledge of salvation. However, even among the nations nothing happens that He does not either permit or design. However, in the New Testament we find out much more than what the prophets could have anticipated. Specifically, we find that the King is not simply a great man but divine, the Son of God in human flesh. And we find that His mission is greater and grander in every way. When the King, The God-man is finished. Nothing is the same. All things become new in him. To see what the New Testament has to say about our King, we will look at the following: his earliest beginnings and the events surrounding them, first-century messianic expectations, messianic imagery, his claims, demands, and self-identity, his reworking of all things around himself, his messianic actions, his conflict with the Jewish leaders, what others said about him, his actions after his triumphal entry, especially taking over the temple, and what the Acts, epistles, and the Revelation have to say about him. In all this, we will find that they never stop talking about the King, that Jesus is first and foremost in all ways, the King who now rules over all. 4.3.1 First Century Messianic Expectations. Like today, first century Palestine was a troubled place. If one were to ask a Jew about the primary cause of the problems, most would reply Rome and the Jewish leadership. Palestine was an occupied territory, occupied by a brutal and powerful empire, and the current Jewish rulers were less than desirable. The Jewish people, however, were responsible for the situation. They had rebelled against their God and suffered his judgment in exile. Thus they anxiously awaited their Messiah who would end their exile and restore the nation and build the true temple. For a time it looked as though their exile had ended, but it was not to last. Their temporary recovery began with revolt in 165 BC by Judas the Maccabee, who defeated the Seleucid occupiers. The Jewish Hasmonean kingdom that followed endured from 140 to 37 BC. They drove out the foreign occupying force, placed a Jew on the throne of Israel, and cleansed the temple. It appeared that Israel's exile was ended and its kingdom restored, but the Hasmonean dynasty ended and passed over into the Herodian dynasty with Herod the Great, a godless and brutal man who ruled at Rome's pleasure, Rome being the real power player. However, Herod continued to claim that he was the legitimate king of the Jews and attempted to seal this legitimacy by marrying the Hasmonean princess Marianne. To remove any Hasmonean threat, he murdered the last Hasmonean male heir in his palace. To further legitimate his claims and endear himself to the Jewish people, he built the temple in Jerusalem, a magnificent structure begun in 20 BC. It was so grand and vast that it was not entirely finished even in Jesus' day. Despite Herod's efforts, he fooled few. He was not the long-awaited Jewish Messiah, for he was a godless man, and in no way did his rule and kingdom approach the greatness of God's coming anointed one. Some even believed that his temple was an abomination, and not the temple spoken of by the prophets. To make matters worse, Herod ruled at the pleasure of Rome. For some Jews, the situation was intolerable. In today's language, they became freedom fighters. The Romans considered them violent, subversive political criminals. One of the largest of these groups were the Zealots. Some of Jesus' followers and apostles had previously been Zealots. This radical, violent, rebellious bent was even found among some of the Pharisees. It appears that Paul may have been part of this more radical and politically active sect before he became a Christian. For the zealot, Rome reserved its most horrific punishment, crucifixion. Thus, for the thinking faithful Jew, Israel was still in exile and in desperate need for the Messiah to come and forgive them in their exile, defeat their domestic oppressors, drive out the pagan occupiers, restore the kingdom to Israel, and build the temple. This king and this king alone was their only hope. These conditions, coupled with the prediction of the Messiah's appearing in Daniel 9:24-27, made the air absolutely electric with messianic expectations. So intense were their expectations that several men appeared claiming to be the Messiah, all of whom were dispatched fairly quickly. It is into this charged atmosphere that Jesus, God's anointed one, enters history. Section 4.3.2 From Birth to the Synagogue. The events surrounding Jesus' birth and the early stages of his ministry are absolutely permeated with messianic themes. In particular, these themes carry the concrete meaning of the coming of a real king who will act decisively, establish his kingdom, and will fundamentally change God's people and their world. The announcement of John the Baptist's birth. The scene opens up on Zacharias, the husband of Elizabeth, the mother of John the Baptizer. As Zacharias, a Levite, is carrying out his duties in the temple, an angel appears and promises that he will have a son who will be God's forerunner to make ready a people for the Lord, and upon whom will rest the spirit and power of Elijah. Zacharias, schooled as he is in the Torah, knows exactly what this means. It is nothing less than the promise that he will be the father of the last great prophet who will announce and prepare for the imminent coming of the final Davidic heir.